Hello, my name is Sabri Adel Sadi, and I am the Francophone Implementation Coordinator at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. On behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, which is called Reproductive Coercion Strategies Used in Intimate and Family Settings, the experience of the women who've experienced them. I'd like to acknowledge that our work is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Leapahawk, and Shonotone. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We make this acknowledgement to counter the doctrine of discovery and recognize Indigenous land and sovereignty. We also recognize that many Black people were violently displaced to Canada through settler colonialism and slavery. We will continue to work collaboratively with communities to challenge colonialism, anti-Black racism, and other forms of oppression that remain pervasive in Canada and that result in disproportionate impacts of gender-based violence on oppressed communities. As a settler in this space, I'm grateful for the many advantages that I have, and I would like to express my gratitude toward Mother Earth for the resources that we use, and I would like to honor all the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples who have lived on these lands for at least 15,000 years. We're very pleased to welcome you to this webinar, during which Carole Boulepsol will talk to us about her work on gender-based violence in a form that's very little documented. She has a degree in sociology, feminist studies, social work, and mental health. Carole is currently finishing up her PhD in human science at the University of Montreal. She will talk to us about the results of her thesis on coercive reproduction in an intimate and family context. She's supervised by Marie-Marthe Cousineau from the University of Montreal and Sylvie Lévesque from UQAM, who is responsible for the laboratory and the research where Carole does her work. In addition to being a social worker, she's also a prof at the Department of Social Work at the University of Quebec in Outaouais, in Saint-Jérôme. She has 15 years experience in intervention and feminist research. Her research interests includes gender-based violence, mental health, migration, partner research, group social work intervention, anti-oppression approaches, and training the next generation in the area of research and psychosocial intervention. I will then be joined by my colleague Marguerite for the question and response session at 2 p.m. Carole, over to you. Hello, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being here. I didn't expect to see more than 330 people interested in learning more on the question of reproductive coercion. So I'd like to thank you for your attention today. And I will try to talk about my thesis and also the collective work that's been done in the area. I'm very happy to have received this invitation, and I hope to be able to talk to you at the end of the presentation. Thank you specifically to the organizers of this webinar, and thank you to the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children from the University of Western Ontario. I especially need to thank Sabri Sadi for his coordination, the invitation, and all the support that he has provided with me in preparing for this presentation. So today, I'm going to talk to you about the research, the results of my doctoral research. It's been a long process of 6 years, and it's finally coming to an end. And so I'm feeling a certain amount of relief. Today I'm going to focus on coercive reproductive strategies, which can be used in an intimate or family setting. And I will be using the scientific literature, and I will also be using data taken from semi-directed interviews, which we did with women who had been affected by coercive reproduction. The presentation today has required working with my supervisors Sylvie Lévesque and Marie-Marthe Cousineau, and many of the things that I'll be talking about today have already been presented in the context of meetings or in local workshops. So without further ado, I will share with you some context. So as I mentioned, this is doctoral research, and it's part of work within the Reproductive Health and Violence Laboratory, directed by Sylvie Lévesque, and she is the main researcher of the most important research project involved in my thesis. This project has involved the work of many researchers affiliated with the University of Montreal, the University of Ottawa, and the University of Quebec in Montreal, or UQAM. It was coordinated by Catherine Rousseau, and there have been many partners, including the Quebec Public Health Institute, as well as Planned Parenthood Ottawa. And so I have a number of affiliations with various universities. I did my thesis at the University of Montreal. And so today I have the privilege to have become a professor at the University of Quebec in Outaouais. So the research led by Sylvie Lévesque, and which involves many partners, including our financial partners, that is to say, the Human Sciences Research Council. And during my thesis, I had the privilege of being supported by a number of institutions, including SASFAM, the Applied Research Center on Family Intimate Violence, the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, and the Canada Graduate Scholarships. So I would like to take the opportunity to thank all of these organizations for the support that they provided me. It meant that I had great conditions during my doctoral research, and this allowed me to complete my research. So when we speak about reproductive coercion, what exactly do we mean? We're talking about a gender-based violence, which concerns mostly women or members of gender minority groups. So reproductive coercion is the result of intentional control strategies on the reproductive autonomy and the control of the reproductive sphere of a person by another person, and it results in a situation where someone is deprived of their reproductive autonomy. And in 2022, UN Women estimates that the reproductive autonomy of more than 1.2 billion women and girls was compromised. And within reproductive coercion, these strategies have three main goals. That is to say, exploiting the reproductive potential of a person, limiting this potential, or destroying it completely. So when we exploit someone's reproductive potential, this means all strategies which seek to impose a pregnancy or a maternity on a person. So we're going to talk about people who will try to make contraceptive tools unavailable or to withdraw them from women. And this is what we hear often about the concept of stealthing. And there are also people who get involved in intimidation or misinformation campaigns to limit access to contraceptives. So in the same vein, to exploit the reproductive potential of someone, there are other people who will try to impose a pregnancy or force someone to take their pregnancy to term. And so these people are facing attacks and strategies that will force them to remain pregnant. And in the same vein, there are also strategies which seek to put pressure on a woman or a person who can become pregnant so that they are forced to become a mother. So there are also strategies seeking to impose the interruption of a pregnancy, even if it's against the will of the pregnant individual. In terms of the third objective, which seeks to destroy the reproductive potential, this may result in a forced sterilization, And of course, when it's not the will or the intention of the person concerned. So there are a number of strategies used in order to achieve these goals, the goals of those who are doing this coercion. And there's recourse to physical force or threatening physical force. There's making people feel guilty. There is limiting access to healthcare services, and even restricting someone's movement. All of these strategies are put into place in order to deprive someone of their reproductive freedom or autonomy. And when we take a look at the literature, what we can see is that today there is no consensus on definitions. That is to say, the definition of behavior that can be qualified as coercive reproduction. And there are a number of reasons for this lack of a consensus. For example, there are certain fragile conceptual elements that need to be solidified. And in terms of definitions, there are associated behaviors. For example, does someone need to have the intention of undermining someone's reproductive autonomy in order for it to be qualified as coercion? So I used some definitions proposed by Laura Tarzia and Kelsey Hegarty, who holds a research chair on the prevention of family violence at the University of Melbourne. And she says that at the intersection of spousal violence, sexual violence, and family violence, we find reproductive coercion. But we shouldn't confuse it with these other forms of violence. She says that reproductive coercion deserves to be recognized as an independent phenomenon, and this phenomenon is characterized, to not be confused with sexual violence or partner violence, by three elements: intention, that is to say, the will of someone to take control of the reproductive autonomy of someone else, the control that is brought about by this intention, and the dimension of fear for the person who's being subject to these actions. In 2021, a study said the following: for women, their bodies are taken hostage by a partner, by a member of the family, out of fear to be physically, psychologically, financially, or sexually hurt if they don't do as they're told. So here we see all of the coercion that's a part of this definition. And a simple example to just make a distinction between this and spousal violence: a spouse, via their behavior, may bring about a miscarriage without having the intention of doing so. But one of the consequences of their behavior isn't necessarily their goal. So in coercion, what it's characterized by this intentional control. And I will now talk about the prevalence and give you some statistics. This is not a marginal phenomenon. That being said, there are certain disparities in the estimations on the prevalence. And this all depends on the definitions that are used, the methods that are used, as well as the samples. But I will tell you about a few statistics. In 2023, under Shannon Ann Wood, who is part of the Department of Health Populations from Johns Hopkins in the United States, she had an international team which published the results of quantitative research on the prevalence of reproductive coercion in 10 regions of low-income countries or medium-income countries. The team observed a prevalence which was between 3.1 and 20.3%. So in the majority of these contexts, it is a prevalence that is less than 10%. There's another research project organized by Jay Silverman, who is an affiliate of the Gender and Equity Center at the University of California. And this research project says that out of 1,770 women, 12% of them had experienced reproductive coercion by a spouse or a member of the family. In the United States, Karen Trister Grace and Elizabeth Miller estimated that American population studies demonstrate that about 8% of respondents who had already experienced reproductive coercion during their lives. And in smaller scale studies involve smaller samples, and so the declared rate of coercive reproduction was somewhere between 25 and 40%. In Canada, unfortunately, we don't have any population-based data on this phenomenon, but I'm going to talk to you about two research projects which are quite interesting. First of all, Sylvie Lévesque's laboratories project, which through data collection done via a questionnaire, and of 427 person, 92% who identified as women, and 63.9% said that they had experienced reproductive coercion. 62.8% had experienced sabotage of their contraception, and 9.8% had been affected by coercion. That is to say, someone who wanted them to terminate their pregnancy. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but could you please slow down a little bit for the interpreters? Still in Quebec, a research project led by Mylène Fernet, who is a sexology professor at UQAM, and the project was also done by an association of women's shelters. This was done in cooperation with another researcher in the area, and during their conference, they demonstrated that data collected from 2,000 women who were staying in women's shelters, they estimated that 41% of the women using these services reported having experienced some kind of reproductive coercion. Among these individuals, 65.9% mentioned that their partner had already at least 3 times forced them to not use contraception so that the person would become pregnant. And so this is hardly a marginal phenomenon given the statistics available in the scientific literature. There's a strong correlation between experiencing spousal violence and reproductive coercion. And there's also a strong correlation between experiencing reproductive coercion and experiencing an unplanned pregnancy. In terms of risk factors, I would like to share a few dimensions of vulnerability. Youth is a vulnerability factor. A low degree of education for the victim or for the person engaging in the acts of reproductive coercion. And as I said, if there's a history of family or spousal violence, this also brings about a correlation. Research done by Elizabeth Price from the University of Queensland in the United States and her colleagues demonstrated that coercion was reported by women who was more reported by those who had experienced partner violence. Another thing that I'd like to point out is researchers, including Bagwell Gray, have demonstrated there's an association between reproductive coercion and the risk of being a victim of feminicide. Another risk factor is belonging to a minority ethnocultural group, and there's quite a bit of research from the United States, the results of which show us a significant association between belonging to a minority ethnic group and experiencing reproductive coercion. And finally, sexual orientation is also something that influences one's risk of experiencing reproductive coercion. There's American research which illustrates that bisexual women are more likely to be victims than heterosexual women. Another research project has concluded that those who have a polysexual sexual orientation are more likely to experience reproductive coercion. And there are also social and cultural conditions, and reproductive coercion often occurs in patriarchal societies. And Patricia Ramito, who is a psychology researcher in Italy, says a social structure in which men hold power. She points out that patriarchal ideology brings about the subordination of women as being something natural, legitimate, and desired, and it is something that is seen as being acceptable or invisible by those who dominate. And as intersectional feminism shows us, the system of the patriarchy is also linked to other systems, racism, colonialism, capitalism, and this overlap differentiates the experience of women. And so in terms of consequences, the literature tells us a number of things that I'd like to share with you. And the most documented consequences are pregnancy, abortion, sexually transmitted infections, also obstacles to divorce, which there are also obstacles to those who want to seek assistance, and there's significant effects on mental health. So Camelia A. Alexander, who works at Johns Hopkins University in the United States, reports that women who have experienced reproductive coercion report more symptoms of depression and PTSD compared with those who have not experienced this type of violence. And these results have been seen elsewhere. Another significant consequence is that experiencing reproductive coercion obliges us to oblige those who are experiencing to resist. They will spend their energy and their resources in order to resist all strategies directed toward them. And this has been documented by researchers. Jessica E. Moulton from Melbourne in Australia. She and her colleagues identified a number of resistance strategies, that is to say, hiding contraceptives or not acknowledging the use of contraceptives. So there are a number of resistance strategies which can be put into place. So in Quebec and in Canada, with respect to reproductive coercion, well, we don't have enough information on the experience of marginalized or minority groups, and it may be that they're simply absorbed into other sources of data. We should take a look at the intersection between these characteristics, and we need to also take a look at the various different contexts, whether it be family, community, cultural context, and the impact on people's experience. So I have tried to focus, therefore. I'm sorry, I'll slow down a bit. So this is a phenomenon that has existed for a long time, but it's named differently. So this is something that people who can become pregnant are experiencing. That is to say, they're being controlled. So it is the term reproductive coercion that is new, and we're now better able to scientifically document these phenomena. There is a certain social relevance of this phenomenon, of course. There is a scientific, social, and political relevance, and developing knowledge on reproductive coercion will eventually allow us to propose avenues in order to facilitate strategies to improve interventions and the ways in which these concerned individuals are assisted. There's also the feminist approach, that is to say, revealing something that is seen as taboo and which requires all of our attention so that we can fight against this form of violence. So the question at the center of my presentation is, what are the strategies used by a spouse or a member of the family to take control of the reproductive potential of an individual? And in terms of the conceptual framework, at the basis, we find a feminist epistemology and a feminist perspective. So these things are critical of an absolute neutrality and an objectivity that would seek to shine a light on the truth. And so I am using this feminist approach, which seeks to come to the assistance of those who are invisible. I'd also like to value feminist practices and to contribute toward the defense of human rights. And I'd also like to have a society where we move forward politically in this area. It's important that we fight together in order to put an end to this phenomenon. So I'm going to talk to you about three conceptual components. First of all, the social appropriation of the body. And here I am making use of a French sociologist's research who wrote regarding on the subject and said the following: the use of one group by another, its transformation into a weapon in order to be advantageous for the dominating group. So here we see the exploitation that is the social appropriation of the body, and she says that the woman's body, that is to say, what creates children, is something that is also appropriated. So we take control over the bodies of a group, that is to say, people who become pregnant, who are mostly women, and violence and threats are used to bring about this control and coercion, whether it's in public or in private. And sociologists describe this as being a means to maintain subordination. Another conceptual framework is the reproductive potential, which is an expression that I'm borrowing from a professor at the social medicine department at Laval University. And in the wake of the Daigle affair, and she wrote this in 1998, she acknowledged that throughout women's lives, experiences pertaining to their reproductive potential in essence, what she is saying is that the reproductive sphere is at the heart of the intersection of genders, and it is an area which is affected by power dynamics. And finally, and perhaps more relevant, perhaps, coercive reproduction, as developed by Evan Stark and also by Emma Catt, who is an expert in coercive control and its impact on children. And there's also Simon Lapierre and Isabelle Côté, who are Quebecois researchers. And so what do they tell us about coercive control? It is considering this violence not as isolated events, but as a group of strategies which are manifest or hidden, which bring about a kind of arsenal made up of the cumulative effects. The idea is to solidify an invisible cage around the person who is being the target of the coercive control, so that their liberty can no longer be exercised. They are deprived of liberty, or the aggressing person may be undermining the other person's own interests.
So here, what I want to retain is that reproductive coercion has to be understood as a whole instead of an isolated incident. So the theoretical recommendation is to adopt a global perspective instead of focusing on single events. When it comes to the methodology used, during my thesis, I had several inclusion criteria that you see here on the screen. So I was trying to meet people who may become pregnant. They were 18 years and up. They had experienced a form of intentional reproductive coercion, and they had lived in a marital context or a family context, because this can also be experienced in other contexts, for example, institutional or medical. And then we moved on to, we did the recruitment process from May 2021 to March 2023. And this was during the pandemic that we knew, so we used several strategies to do so. I can talk about them if you're interested during the question period. When it comes to ethics, obviously we got ethics certifications, we had information consent forms, ethics training, and I also needed to include a reflective practice in my work. For myself, for my research as well, I wanted to make sure that I could reflect on the impacts of my research, the impacts that this reproductive coercion was having on the women that I was meeting. And also, this research has had a significant impact on me. I was perturbed. I had several emotions, and I tried to make sure that I looked after my mental health. When it comes to data collection, well, it was held with semi-directed interviews. It was recorded on digital audio media. There was an information form on supplementary demographic information that we were asking people to fill out. And we also distributed resources. There was a list that you will find at the end of my presentation. When it comes to the processing and analysis, we did a full transcription of the interviews. We anonymized them. We used multiple analysis processes. So basically, we looked at all the data transversally, all the themes, all the situations, to see if they were converging or diverging of all the narratives we received. We analyzed all the trajectories that had been told to us. And as feminists, as well as researchers, we made sure that there was knowledge transfer and retrieval possible. A little bit like what I'm doing with you today. Okay, let's talk about outcomes. Who were the participants? So in the greater research that was managed by Sylvie Lévesque, we had 33 interviews. For my thesis, I chose 18 among those 33, and I based this choice on the criteria I mentioned earlier. So half was born in Quebec, half was born elsewhere, so 4 in Africa, 3 in the Americas, excluding Canada, and two were from South Asia. Most of them at the time of the interviews were Canadian citizens, so that's 13. And several of the respondents who had experienced reproductive coercion came from a much more precarious situation. Half of the participants were white, 5 were racialized, 4 were Black, and overall, 2 identified as being Indigenous. There's also the religious beliefs. You can see it on the screen. You can see atheists, Muslims, spiritual, etc. The majority spoke French. They were between 25 and 45 years old. And when it comes to children, 5 of them had no children, 7 had 1, and 6 had 1 or more children. So when they experienced reproductive coercion, all of them identified as women. But during the interview, 1 identified as non-binary or a gender. When it comes to sexual orientation, most were heterosexual, and 3 were bisexual, 2 were pansexual, and 1 was questioning. when they spoke of their relationships. There are a few differences. Some had been in a relationship for 1 year, others up to 16 years. 9 were married, 14 had lived with their spouse, and 4 had lived with their in-laws or with their family when they were in a relationship. We can ask ourselves, who are the perpetrators? Well, there are 3 here on screen. Firstly, the spouse is the only perpetrator when it comes to reproductive coercion. That was the case for 10 women. Secondly, the spouse, and simultaneously, the family or the in-laws, and that was the case for 6 women. And thirdly, for 2 women, it was either only the family or the in-laws who were imposing reproductive coercion. So the only situations where the spouse was the perpetrator, when the spouse was the perpetrator, there was domestic violence. So I think it's interesting to keep that in mind, that the family and in-laws were also acting as perpetrators. And we can see that there's intersectionality of various contexts here, intimate and family. So there were 2 objectives of coercive strategies based on our interviews with women. None of them said that they experienced reproductive coercion looking to destroy their reproductive potential. But 15 said that they experienced coercive strategies to exploit their reproductive potential. For example, the pressure to be a mother for 15 of them, forcing full-term pregnancy for 11 of them, and sabotaging contraceptives for 8. Then 7 mentioned that they had experienced coercive strategies wanting to limit their reproductive potential, whether it was a forced termination of pregnancy, discouraging reproduction, or forcing a miscarriage. It's interesting to note that in all of the forms of violence used in reproductive coercion, we find physical, sexual, economic, verbal, psychological, spiritual, and other forms of control. So in my little diagram, what I tried to show is that psychological violence, verbal violence, spiritual violence, these are the forms of violence most often used when it comes to reproductive coercion. So what will be easiest to spot is really at the tip of the iceberg, because in reality, there are so many types of strategies that are violent that are used for reproductive coercion, and that will contribute to slowly close the cage and limit the person's reproductive potential. And this is what I try to focus on. And there were obviously some more obvious strategies, but when we know about reproductive coercion theory, I really tried to find the strategies, 5 strategies that are typical, that I found in behaviors that were evidently seen and behaviors that were more hidden. And I tried to demonstrate how there was an arsenal of strategies that are used to do this. So the first set of strategies is seduce and encourage. So here the family or the spouse will benefit from the woman's youth, of her lack of experience. So one said, I was young, I didn't have a lot of life experience, I wasn't experienced in relationships, so I was easily manipulated at that age. Others will tell us that they married quickly, so they lived together quickly. For some, there were arranged marriages, and this created quick unions from the moment they met their partner to the moment they started living with him. Others spoke of the honeymoon, where they thought this was a relationship that was going to be free of violence. So that's part of the strategies that are used to tame, if you will, the woman. In others, the spouse or family members will try to convince the woman by mirroring a renewed relationship with kids. Everything will change. Your life will be more pleasurable. Family will be ideal. So they create some form of image, a romanticized image of family, of couples, so that they can convince the woman to give in. And then others will promote reproductive potential as means to a strong filiation. So some women mentioned that their parents had pressured them by saying that if they had kids, they would be contributing to someone taking care of them when they were older. They were um, that if they had several children, this is how things were supposed to be done. And then in seduction strategies, we also find the promotion of motherhood and women who are mothers. So some women said, in marital advice I got was like, know that in marriage, your big personality will cause problems for you. You have to be submissive, gentle, docile, and above all, you need to become a mother quickly because that softens women. Another strategy is to exploit vulnerabilities. So spouses or family members will take advantage of poverty or economic dependency. They'll take advantage of the woman's isolation, especially if it's an immigrant woman or if there's been several moves across Canada. They will also exploit children in this way. Basically, with the women I met, the children represent their vulnerabilities or their major concern. And the spouse or the family use it as a lever, use these children as levers. Another example is related to poverty, and you can see it on the screen here in the quotation. One of the women said, I had so little money at the time and so few people around me that I was afraid. I was afraid of losing him. That's how I had children against my will. So still under exploiting vulnerabilities, we have the migration pathways and the conditions when it comes to migration, settling in Canada. These can be things that can be used by the spouse or the families. For example, one woman said that her spouse who wanted her to abort kept telling her that he had paid for her immigration, that he had paid for her, therefore she had to bend to his will. Others have a precarious status. This means that they don't have access to health services in reproductive health, and this limits their capacity in being autonomous. Then there's an administrative dependency, and what that means is women sponsored, for example, by family members or their spouse. Another woman who was an immigrant, told us that isolation and a loss of reference points was part of the vulnerabilities that were exploited. This is what she writes. I think it's being an immigrant woman that has had an impact, not so much the origins and all that, but the situation, as I was saying, about being a little vulnerable because we didn't have social networks. Third set of strategies is to monitor and invade. For example, the spouse will try to track the ovulation period. He'll require doors to stay open when she goes to the washroom. He'll check the calendar, the schedule, the work schedule. He'll check if she has medical appointments. He'll be there for the medical appointments. He'll also try to limit outings or ask about them in detail. One of the participants said, just before I got pregnant, he was asking me to write it on the calendar. He asked me, when is your ovulation day? So he could track my days on the calendar. And then in family and in-laws context, here we see controlling the reproduction chain. And I wrote it this way because one woman told us that a member of her in-laws would check her bed regularly to make sure that to see if she had her period, yes or no, and to see if she had produced a child. Others will supervise and control outings and visits. There's even a sentinel system that's been put in place in certain family contexts. I call this a sentinel system because it's related to what the women stated. They said they felt supervised by everyone in their family, everyone around them. So basically, aunts, cousins, parents, in-laws, everyone would ask them regularly where they were at in their contraceptive trajectory. So as I said earlier, if we isolate this event, we might start to normalize the thing. But really, this is the accumulation of all the strategies, and we have to take into account the context. For example, so a person who's isolated from uh, someone who's emptying the garbage in the bathroom, can do so, but somebody could use the garbage can in the bathroom to check if the woman has her period and to know what the ovulation cycle is like so that they can impose sexual relations. So this is a reproductive coercion dynamic. Fourth set of strategies, that is to sabotage and trap. So toss or hide contraceptives, pierce them, damage them. Others will do stealthing, as I mentioned earlier. So they'll pretend they're putting on a condom, but they'll take it off before penetrating the partner so that they get pregnant. Others will rape their partners. Some will lie. They'll say they're infertile, they've had a vasectomy, there's no risks of pregnancy, that they prefer having sex without using a condom. Some women told us that there were lies to trap them to become pregnant. Others will criticize or cast doubt, and this is in the family context and in the intimate context. For example, one participant said, I didn't have access to contraception anymore. He wouldn't let me on the pretext that if I take contraceptives, it will not be very good for making milk for the baby, and I should not take pills and breastfeed at the same time. He refuses to wear a condom. So that happened quite frequently. So strategies using false information that casts doubt on choices, on means of contraception used by the woman. The fifth set of strategies is to threaten and attack. So here here it aims to retain resource monopoly, which we see in intimate violence, make and change rules. For example, a spouse was responsible for reproductive coercion by forcing his partner to become pregnant. He decides that she won't have access to contraception. He uses sexual violence, etc. She becomes pregnant, and for various reasons, he changes his mind, and then he changes the rules. So originally, he was responsible for reproductive coercion to force her to become pregnant. During her pregnancy, since he's changed his mind and he's changed his strategies to make sure he defends his own interests, he will impose abortion. He will threaten her in the first part of the situation, as well as the second part of the situation. And if she doesn't, to be violent, if she doesn't bend to his will. Others showcase their strength. They'll scream in the house. For example, the participant here said he was shouting in the house, he was swearing. He didn't hit me, but I still experienced all that violence. So basically, instead of discussing as a couple or as a family calmly of contraceptives and choices for reproduction, he'll scream. And when he wants to really showcase a possible consequence, not directly on the women, but indirectly by using objects he throws against the wall, on the table, by hitting the table, this really shows that he's able to move to physical violence. Eventually, gradually, if she refuses to do what he wants. And often, spouses and family members will remind the woman of the consequences. Some participants told us that they had been threatened that they would be left, that they would lose their inheritance from the family if they didn't submit themselves to the family will. they were threatened to be shown the door, or that the spouse would take on another wife or would be unfaithful, etc., etc. Others, when it comes to attacking the woman, and it's more than invading, it's really about taking control of the narrative and of the reproductive situation. For example, they portray alternative realities. And what do I mean here? Well, there are spouses or family members who have used uh, a double face. You know, to the woman, they say, we respect your choice, do what you will at your own tempo. And then simultaneously, they use various strategies to constrain her. So there's the alternative reality here. I am thinking of a situation where a violent spouse went to a reproductive health medical space and started to cry, started to explain all sorts of stuff. And this with an aim to limit the woman's use of the services. Others will threaten to contribute to the woman's bad reputation. What will people think if you have an abortion? What will people think if you have another child? What will they think, etc., etc.? Others share bad omens. In some situations, women were told that they were possessed, that they must have done something wrong, and that this was their punishment, and this is in link with religious and spiritual violence. And others were threatened with death. It could be femicide, so directly, or homicide of their spouse, or infanticide of their child. So threats were used in order to ensure reproductive coercion. One participant said, there were death threats. I'm going to kill you. You're carrying my child. You're not going to have a relationship with someone else. I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to kill my child if I have to, but you're mine. So earlier, I was speaking of vulnerabilities for the women, for example, children. So obviously, in a reproductive coercion setting, an intimate partner violence setting, when women are threatened with death or with the death of their child, this will limit the women's options. It will solidify the bars of her cage we spoke about earlier. Others will requisition or take over. A woman said, I felt like I didn't belong to myself. My uterus had fallen into the public domain. And this was in a family context. Others will form alliances. Spouses form alliances with their mother so that they can exercise reproductive coercion towards the woman. Others will denigrate, belittle, neglect, guilt the woman. And as I said earlier, they'll use force, they'll harass. One woman said, he called me in the middle of the night, in the mornings, every day. We'll see each other. And the subject was, abort, please, abortion. So there's the cumulative aspect of harassment. So the consequences were as follows. The freedom of the woman was curtailed. Immigrant women mentioned that it was harder for them to return to their country of origin because they were worried that they would continue experiencing reproductive coercion. A second impact is that their integrity is damaged, both in mind and in body. One of the women contracted an STD. Others had to have several abortions, even though they didn't want to, because they experienced various reproductive coercion strategies. For others, identity was weakened. Notably, bisexual women shared that there were identity issues. Their identity was fragilized because of this reproductive coercion. So here are two quotations. The first says, He used me like a tool to give him a child. He used my body. He used me for his own purposes. And another, I felt like I was swimming at the surface and then trying all the time to reach a rescue buoy to get me out. I was constantly thinking. I was hypervigilant all the time, weighing the pros and cons. And that hypervigilance exists during sexual relationships when the woman is afraid of becoming pregnant, afraid that there's sabotage happening. And when it comes to the family or the in-laws, hypervigilance means the woman wonders if she'll be stuck during a family party or a social gathering where several people will attack her with various reproductive coercion strategies, will interrogate her. Where are you at? Why? How many children do you want? When will you be pregnant? Etc. They also live in fear of consequences, but they resist. All the women I've encountered resist one way or the other. They're always threatened. That's one of the consequences of being separated within the couple or separated within family relations. One said, "You won't be the first to not have children in the family. You must be like your cousin. You must do like other women in the community, etc. Otherwise, you are no longer part of the family group." So there's a threat that's internalized where the woman wonders, if I continue trying to be autonomous when it comes to reproductive potential, will I be outcast from the family? And that separation, that rupture, was also brought up with regards to ethnocultural groups, where the women can be told, you are not a true this I don't want to identify a particular group, because if you were, you would already have children. So if you don't do it, it's that you are not part of our group. One participant said, it's like this all the time. If you don't have children and all that, he's going to take a second wife. So this is a threat of breakup. Or his mother will make him take a second wife so that she can have his child, because that would mean you can't have a child. So she would have to, because he has to have an offspring. If you can't do it, someone else will. So to conclude, I want to speak of different findings. Firstly, in theory, the theoretical idea of an arsenal was validated. It's never an isolated behavior. There's something about intensity, frequency, microregulation, as spoken of in literature. So this all contributes to undermine the reproductive terrain and to limit freedom. Another thing is that when it comes to family context, eh bien, well, mother-in-laws are at the head of the crowd. And other women, sometimes mothers, but it's usually the in-laws and usually the mother-in-law. And obviously, sometimes the family takes part as well. But what we notice is that in the intimate context, it's men. And in the family context, many women contribute or even convince the spouse to exercise reproductive coercion. What we see is that it hasn't always been obvious for victims and for participants to identify that there had been reproductive coercion. They didn't have the words, they didn't have the right references, they hadn't been validated in their impressions, and several felt guilty. And that surprised me. So I'd like to share something. What really surprised me was how taboo it is. Taboo surrounds victims of reproductive coercion because obviously there's sexual violence between partners often, and when children have been imposed on a woman, and she loves her children, she might feel ambivalent when it comes to telling myself, a researcher, members of my team, that she had children despite herself, but she loves them. So there's a taboo there that exists. Lastly, I really enjoyed Stark's work, and I propose here some metaphors. So, reproductive potential as a resource where the person is set aside completely, and this resource is to be exploited, limited, or destroyed, and this to profit someone else. There are coercive campaigns that are based on an ownership ideology, as I spoke to earlier, a surveillance system, an arsenal of control strategies, and a true propaganda. So, a form of communication that is both persuasive and that wants to influence opinions, attitudes, emotions of a person, and promote an idea in order to generate a behavior. So there's really a propaganda happening. Some women told us that they had been brainwashed and that this propaganda from the spouse, from society, from family had contributed to building this cage around her where they find themselves despite themselves. So to conclude, I want to share with you a few avenues for future research. So continue exploring modulation of reproductive coercion. So basically, go beyond family and an intimate partner context. Go check cultural, social, institutional contexts. Deepen knowledge on resistance strategies used by women when they experience reproductive coercion. And continue exploring ways in which social representations and material conditions and symbols will influence a woman's experiences. Avenues for practice. We should train more professionals to spot situations where reproductive coercion exists. So taking into account the whole context without isolating certain components and certain behaviors, examining intent and fear. Another avenue is to develop awareness-raising tools that are culturally adapted. And by that, I mean for all cultures. And lastly, as we've done for intimate violence and in the public sphere, let's talk about training, self-defense for women who could be targeted by reproductive coercion strategies. So this is something interesting that could be evaluated. So I will now show you some resources that have to do with the research that we have done in the Reproductive Health Laboratory. They're available here in French, also available in English. And I will also share my contact information with you. I'm very much open to having exchanges with you following this webinar, and I'd very much like to hear your questions and your comments. I will also share my list of references used during my preparation for this presentation. And I would like to apologize to the interpreters. I tried to slow down, but I didn't do very well. So I'd very much like to apologize to the interpreters. And I'd like to thank all the participants for their attention and for their participation. And I'm ready to have some discussions with you. So thank you very much for your attention. I feel very privileged. Thank you very much, Carole, for your very rich and informative presentation. We have a number of questions in the Q&A box. So Margarita is going to
give me a hand in moderating the Q&A period. So I have a first question that has a number of questions within it. So I'll try to ask it in the right way. First of all, a couple of clarification questions. A number of participants wanted to know, when you were speaking about in-law families, do you mean simply this in-law family, or do you mean only the woman's family? Thank you for the question. Well, it's a good question. It's the entire family entourage. So the family and the in-law family. So it's I can't tell you the exact proportions, but what I noticed from my data is the in-law family is very active, but in the majority of cases, and I'm trying to recall, aside from one, it is aside from one situation, the in-law family is always involved in some way or another at a certain time when it comes to reproductive coercion. That is simply the reality. As I said, for the most part, it is women in the in-law family who are doing these things. Thank you, Carole. It's very important that we bring this clarification. There was another clarification question regarding the way participants were chosen. How did you go about selecting your participants? People are interested in your methodology. I love methodology, and I could talk about it for hours and hours. So the inclusion criteria, well, my doctoral research, and I'm sorry, I'm going to speak more slowly. Sorry to the interpreters. I'm very sorry. So, as I was saying, this doctoral research is part of a broader research project. And so we use certain inclusion criteria, which are the following: be someone who can become pregnant, be 18 or over, you have to have experienced some sort of reproductive coercion, and we didn't specify whether it was intentional or not. It was one of the criteria for me, that it was intentional, and the person had to also live in Ontario or Quebec, and they had to be able to speak English or French. Thank you for telling us about the inclusion criteria. Another question before we pass the floor to Margarita, and it's a question from France. Thank you, Fatima, for your question. Sexual violence are things often that are not discussed by victims. So how can we address this? Do we need to train professionals better? I'd like to hear what you have to say on this. Well, it's a very broad question, and I don't want to take the responsibility of speaking beyond my expertise. So I want to tell you that it's a fairly complicated question. And how can I respond simply? First of all, feminist groups who have been very important in supporting victims of sexual violence in Quebec and in France, these groups have put into place resources which are complementary, and they provide individual and group support. And I think group support is important because it's something that interests me, but also group interventions allow us to have a consensus as to what we have experienced. That is to say that there are many people who have experienced the same thing. And this is one of the most important cornerstones that we need to communicate to everyone, not only to the victims, but to everyone. Unfortunately, sexual violence, intimate partner violence, reproductive coercion, these things are realities experienced by many people. So that's just something that you need to keep in mind. Secondly, and in Sylvie Lévesque's lab, there are some tools that have been made available to social workers And it's very important that the woman can do things at her own speed. She should be able to explain what's happened, to be validated. And I was talking about the garbage can. It's not simply emptying the garbage can. It's why is someone doing that? Are they looking for certain information? So it's a question of decoding and demystifying. We want to remind people that it is the perpetrator who is responsible, that impacts are quite significant, and we should remind people that this violence is not only something that is visible. It's not only, and in the area of sexual violence, there's an adage that says that seeding is not consenting. So, contrary to the image we might have about rape and sexual violence, which happen following a psychological campaign, a campaign of manipulation, of pressure. So I know my answer is complicated, but it's a complicated question. So first of all, I would say that we need to use feminist practices, whether they be in group or among individuals. We need to validate those who are sharing their experiences. It's necessary to find metaphors and contextualized examples in order to make the ways that these things can happen explicit. Perpetrators need to always be responsible. And of course, we need to demonstrate solidarity. And we need to have safe spaces where these things can be discussed. And one final thing, and it's something that I say in my recommendations, there are minority groups, and within these groups, there's a variety of journeys and trajectories. So this is the difficulty of a social worker or in research. How do we see social groups as groups? There's a question of a balance of power, and within these groups, there are other balances of power, and these are not homogeneous groups. Thank you, Carole, for providing us with this response. I'll pass the floor over to Margarita for the next question, which will be in English. Thank you, Sabri.
Next question is, do you know if there's any legislation that specifically protects women against financial violence?
Je vais répondre en français vu que
I'm
c'est ma
going
langue
to
maternelle.
answer in French because it's my native language. I couldn't tell you about legislative conditions on financial violence. Was that the question? Yes. I'm not an expert in the area. I'm not well suited to answer the question. And I would say that it very much depends on where the person who asked the question is located, but it's a good question. And I was saying that as a feminist, I recognize feminist knowledge and feminist practices and knowledge produced within feminist groups. So it's a good question that you could ask to advocacy groups who work with victims of sexual violence. I think that these groups would be better suited. Thank you, Carole. So we've got a question. Could you talk about the link between reproductive constraint and forced adoption? Not necessarily within your research, but more generally. In other words, have you seen any publications that established a link between coercion and human trafficking for the purposes of forced procreation? Thank you for your very interesting presentation. That's from the person who has asked the question. Thank you, Paula, for your question. I think that the question is very relevant. You have suggested that there are links that could be interesting avenues of research. And you are bringing up the limits of my research, and that's a good thing. These are things that I didn't explore. However, I do know that there are certain things that you could find in the literature on various things which may be relevant in the context of your question. For example, there are certain sexual exploitation situations, and there's some research on strategies for reproductive coercion versus sexual coercion. And some of this research focuses on contract clauses for migrant workers, temporary migrant workers, where they're explicitly asked to not become pregnant. So this is a kind of reproductive coercion. And I wouldn't say that it's a kind of human trafficking, but it certainly has to do with international relations between countries of the North and the South. In terms of forced adoption, well, I'm not sure. I couldn't answer the question, but I'm certain that you'd be able to find some resources on this, and I'd ask you to write me an email if you have any further questions.
Thank you, Carol. I will ask you another question in English. What are some of the obstacles to detecting reproductive coercion for victims and professionals? Are there any risk assessments?
Pouvez-vous me traduire pour être sûr là?
Could you translate the question? You're talking about risk factors that need to be taken into consideration? No, the question is what obstacles exist in detecting reproductive coercion for victims and for professionals? And is there a way to evaluate one's risk? In terms of one's ability to evaluate the risk, I'm not sure. I'm more interested in the qualitative side of things, which involves surveys, and it doesn't necessarily allow us to have definite criteria. So I will send Sabri some resources that were produced by Sylvie Lévesque's team, which may be useful to you. So what I can tell you from memory is that if a woman has gotten the pill a number of times, and of course abortion is a fundamental right, perhaps for this person, if she's alone, it would perhaps be a good idea to ask her about the conditions of her relationship. Does she have the impression that she had a choice? Does she have the resources that she needs in order to make use of her reproductive autonomy? And again, it's very important to inform people. We shouldn't take things for granted. We shouldn't take for granted that we all have access to the same information, or that we all are aware of our rights, and the fact that it's completely legitimate to exercise these rights. And if possible, it's good to open doors to people. And if we want to identify spousal violence, it's good to ask open questions to suggest interpretations, of course, all the while respecting the pace at which the person wants to do things. But that being said, this is not my area of expertise, so I will send Sabri a few documents in English and in French, which were produced by the laboratory.
Merci, Carole.
Thank you, Carole. We have a question that relates to the outcomes you talked about. You said that several participants had experienced reproduction coercion related with cultural violence. How could you have those types of conversations when it comes to reproductive coercion, and that in a respectful manner? The answer. Well, firstly, does the person have access to the information in her mother tongue? That's a very good first question. And then, is the cultural context taken into account? So here we might be able to work with some interpreters in cultural mediation. And then some businesses say that they are not involved in religion, and I use quotes here, and that could help with a women's pathway. So we've had women who have said that they had traditional medicine that were unsolicited, and they were given these medicines several times, and that made them think that they had to be fixed. And at that time, they didn't have children, so they didn't feel that they needed to be fixed. So these are cultural elements. There are others I'm thinking, for example, of a woman who was told she was possessed. So if we don't talk about religion, about the spiritual dimension, well, you know, we could not spot some strategies that are used and that are actually question the woman with regards to her choices. You know, sometimes the woman is confused by what her environment tells her, especially when it comes to the religious elements and her own spirituality. So I think that these are things that need to be taken into account: language, culture, religion. We also need to give access to content in several languages, not just French and English. And as for any other intervention, we can't be an expert in every culture. So we need to inform ourselves to understand what are the conditions. For example, in the country of origin, is abortion legal? Are there abortion services? In the country of origin, is contraceptive frowned upon? So all of these are cultural items that you know, remind us that this isn't a universal question. And it helps us also to really understand the complexities and the intersectionalities of the women we're supporting. You know, earlier I spoke of the effects of racism, of colonialism, all these things that we have to take into account, because what happens in the private sphere has ramifications in historical context, social context, political contexts. You know, earlier we did a land acknowledgement, and we see that there are still racist and colonialist aspects in our daily lives. And these affect women. Thank you, Carole, for that very complete answer. So, one last question. And this is more related to how strategies for reproductive coercion are hidden within a relationship. You talked about it briefly, but could you talk a bit more? Okay, hidden for whom? The person who's experiencing it, or the person's surroundings? Oh, both. Okay. The answer. Well, as I've said earlier, for the woman experiencing these strategies that are looking to sabotage or trap, by definition, well, there's people that have noticed after the fact that they had been trapped, but they didn't notice in the moment. So these are spouses or family members who are responsible. And even before they act, they will gather information. They will take control of various resources. Are there cameras outside or inside the home that mean that when somebody moves, the person can be seen? Does the woman have access to money or not? There are several questions. So there's also the lies, you know, if your spouse says that he has a vasectomy. So this is a form of reproductive coercion. The woman finds out once she's pregnant. So it's unfortunate. But perpetrators and family members are very imaginative, and they're able to hide their intent, their behavior in several ways. And sometimes the people around the woman don't notice. For example, in Quebec, we have policies based on natality. You know, and it's something that happens quite regularly. Women are pressured to have children. But remember, it's not just pressure, it's about being afraid, being controlled, and it's about being afraid of the consequences. So that's important. So how is it hidden from the people around the woman? Well, some spouses will tell their partner, no, I respect your choice. And then behind their back, will contact their family, their in-laws to exercise reproductive coercion. For example, you know, there's things I read and I thought I was in a military campaign. You know, basically headquarters getting organized to launch reproductive coercion campaigns. So there are so many strategies that are hidden, that are less visible, and that contribute to reproductive coercion. So basically comments like, oh, you know, if you really loved me, you would do it. If you were a true best elder daughter, you would do it. So it might seem meaningless if it's a one-time incident, but if the woman is afraid of the consequences, if she doesn't submit to the demand, and if and what we don't know is that there could also be the deprivation of liberty. So thank you, Carol, for all these links, that all these connections that you've made with what you talked about earlier. Thank you. We're out of time today. Thanks, Carol, for being with us today. Thanks to all the participants here today. Thank you to the interpreters, Sylvie Rodrigue and Peter McNichol. Thank you to Jennifer Best and Courtney Cockburn, who are the ASL interpreters, and Joël Fortin and Marie-Jacques Tremblay, the FLSQ interpreters. At the end of the webinar, you will receive an assessment survey. Please fill it in, and you will receive a participation certificate. Thank you, everyone. And on behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub team, see you soon.